right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to Mediocre Rumor Brothers. Today we're going to be having today's topic about PlayStation 1 versus the N64. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to our Spotify, Twitter, YouTube, and a Rumble channel so you always keep up to date. For today's episode, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Udon to go ahead and walk us through. Go ahead, Udon.
All right, so just a bit of prologue. What sparked this conversation was that I've been playing a lot of Bonanza, which made me think about getting a cartridge of Donkey Kong 64. And I like gaming history and like the stories behind how consoles and games are made. And I started looking more into the N64, and I kind of realized I'm like, wow, a lot of people look at this console like very reverently. Like people love the N64, right? But the more I looked into it, it's like, damn, PlayStation like vastly outperformed the N64. I'm going to be throwing some numbers at you guys throughout today, but like for a quick one, just to kind of really hammer home what I mean is that during its lifespan, the N64 sold 32 million units worldwide. That's everywhere, right? The PlayStation sold 102 million units worldwide through its lifespan. So
Wow.
like 70 million more units, right? You know, well, you wouldn't have expected that based on, at least in my experience too, because I'm going to be hitting with you guys with some facts. We're just going to be talking about our own personal experiences with both these consoles and our viewpoints on them. But yeah, I know when I was growing up, everyone that I knew was always playing the N64. I didn't have a lot of guys playing the PlayStation around me. So seeing those kinds of numbers up there was kind of shocking. So I was like, oh, I'm going to look into this more. And I found lots of interesting facts I'm sharing today, and you guys, sharing with you guys. We can all share our own views and experiences on them, and tell me what you think of it. So brief history lesson for how the N64 and the PlayStation became a thing. Back in the ye olden days when video games were good, Nintendo was sitting pretty with the Super Nintendo. And fun fact, Sony helped develop the audio systems for the Super Nintendo. But as the Sega Saturn came out and began to outpace the old Super Nintendo, obviously Nintendo themselves decided to, that was like, all right, well, you got to look into new hardware. Initially, they were teaming up with Sony and Philips, and for any people in the know, yes, I mean Philips, the people who made the infamously bad Zelda CD-ROM games. They were teaming up with them to try and make a disc-based, like a CD-ROM expansion of the Super Nintendo. But I'm not going to bore you with the entire story, but long story short, that it ended up falling through horribly, and Nintendo actually kind of blindsided Sony by dropping the deal very suddenly and deciding to work overseas with other people in an attempt. I think it was actually Philips instead of Sony. And Sony, being big mad after all of that, after the work they put into it, and the kind of backstabbing way Nintendo went about it, because Nintendo dropped them because they were concerned that the deal that they worked out with the CD-ROMs, because I guess PlayStation was able to keep the licensing fees for the CD-ROMs, meaning Nintendo couldn't charge people for the licensing to put games on their console. And generally, Nintendo thought they were getting the short end of the stick on the entire deal, so they decided to drop the whole thing. And funnily enough, they were scared of bringing Sony into the video game market because they knew they could be a big competitor. So in the attempt to not have that happen, they ended up having that happen. And ironically creating Sony and PlayStation kind of out of pure spite almost. So Sony went off and did their own thing with their CD-ROM systems and their audio systems, and like, you know what, fuck it, we're going to make our own video game console with blackjack and hookers. And so they went on to make the PlayStation. I'm skipping a whole lot of detail, but we're not here to go super into their backstory. But basically, so that spawned the PlayStation was initially a disk drive for the Super Nintendo. After that, technology developed a bit more, and Nintendo partnered up with other software companies, which obviously, by the way, their deal with Philips fell through, and that CD-ROM expansion for the Super Nintendo never happened. But technology improved, and Nintendo partnered up with a couple other software companies that were able to make, obviously this is the era where 3D graphics were becoming the norm. And they're like, oh, we have this new technology now, we're going to focus on 3D graphics, right? And so they partnered up with these new software companies, and essentially that's how the N64 came to be. Now, the PlayStation released in 1995, roughly. It released in December of 1994 for Japan, and then September 1995 for the rest of the world. And then the N64 released the following year in 1996. So essentially, the biggest, and, it's funny too, when they created the N64, obviously they decided to stick with cartridge based games. I'll go into more detail with those later, but I'll stop there for a brief moment. But growing up, did you guys have an N64 or a PlayStation or both? And if you didn't, what did your friends have, and what did you mainly play on growing up?
Yes, I did. Actually, our end card picture of the TVs is my bedroom as a kid that has my PlayStation and 64 in it with like an opened strategy guide for Zelda, which is kind of fun. But the PlayStation 1, I didn't have right away. That took a minute. I think I used to go over to Jordan's place to play with him, and my dad and his dad were playing Kingsfield on PlayStation 1, and they played that so much that it made my dad want to buy a PlayStation 1. But the 64, I got that first, and I think it's just because my parents are more familiar with Nintendo products, and it was really neat because when I got a 64, I think it was like my 10th birthday or something. I was the first kid in the neighborhood to have one, and so everybody came over, and we were all playing like Star Fox and stuff, and it's such a like interesting moment because it's such a like nice memory to have when I think back of like obtaining both of these consoles, because it was really fun. And me and Jordan played these together all the time.
Yeah. Mine was kind of vice versa. I still remember mine. I got mine when I was at Chuck E. Cheese. Hell yeah. I was a little kid, and my birthday I got the PlayStation, and it was funny because the PlayStation, it almost seemed like it was like a nudge out of the way kid kind of thing, because I got my Tekken game. That was the first thing I got, but I did not notice that my father also had purchased Kingsfield and some other games as well. I think it was like Ridge Racer or something like that. So I would be able to play a little bit of my Tekken and then basically get moved to the side, and then my dad would take over and you'd play Kingsfield, and it basically would have very limited amount of time on the system. But after that, quite a bit of ways, I ended up playing with Corey quite a bit over his house because he had the N64, I didn't. I had the PlayStation, so I was going to his house and we were playing games and such, and then I eventually got enough for later on to get myself the N64, and I was playing the game that I played the shit out of was Super Smash Brothers. That was one of the huge things in GoldenEye. Like those things I played a shit ton, more than I did the PlayStation. But my father, and then they were playing Final Fantasy VII and all this stuff, and then I ended up getting into those kind of games, and it kind of just like merged into this giant family of video games. More than likely, I was getting the PlayStation games just because that was my dad's side, I was buying things, and then on my mom's side, I'd be getting the N64 because it's kind of toss up of both. So I kind of got a little bit of here and there, but my library just started picking up more and more, and started inviting people over, play at my house, because that was kind of the thing. Had everything out there that everybody could just come over and play. And I know I had talked about that in our previous podcast, where I was just like almost feeling like I was inviting strangers over, because it was back then where the playing side by side was like a huge deal. So literally, if you had an extra controller, you could literally have somebody, you guys could play side by side in the same TV, versus nowadays you need a whole brand new console and another TV for this all to work out. So good days, good memories for me.
It's funny when you said you caught it at Chuck E. Cheese. I was like, did you fucking pay like 8 billion tickets to get a fucking PlayStation?
He won it. Yeah.
And side note, I always find that funny when you go to like Dave and Buster's, even nowadays, like you can win a PlayStation 5. I was like, probably the amount of money you're going to spend in order to get that many tickets is going to vastly exceed just buying the fucking console, but whatever.
Yeah.
But so that being said, you definitely seem to have both of you seem to have like a better memories dealing with the N64 than the PlayStation then, right?
Not really.
Overall?
I mean, I played 64 a lot. I have a pretty decent library of 64 games, but the JRPG is what kind of pulled me into the PlayStation. and not like Metal Gear Solid and stuff of action games, because I did play some action games on PlayStation 1, but I really like resonated with JRPGs, and because they take so long to play. So it's like, here's a game for Christmas, and then I'll be playing it all winter or whatever. To preface this, me and Jordan grew up in Alaska, so we have long, cold winters. So there's a lot of staying inside and doing something. So, we would, that's why I'd play 64 and invite everybody over to the house. I think I borrowed Star Fox from my neighbor for like a month, Wave Race 64 and stuff. Most of the experimental games that I have are on 64, but I would almost argue that like every game on 64 is experimental. Whereas PlayStation, my library on PS1 kind of gravitates towards Squaresoft and other Capcom, other JRPG producers, I guess. There's a handful of games that are just out there on PS1 for me, but we played them both equally because there was a lot of 2-player games for me and Jordan to play, and I think that's primarily what my library consists of, is these multiplayer games, because Jordan would come over on the weekends and we would play together.
Now, and that's interesting, right? Because, like I said, the numbers for this, just, strict numbers, was surprising to me. Before I share my end, Edwin, I know you and me are probably a bit younger in terms of like when these consoles came out, because I don't think I'm even aware I was even alive these consoles even came out. But looking back on it, do you prefer the 64 over the PlayStation, or vice versa? Like, which one do you prefer? And what game do you like games on both? Which ones do you like better on either one?
I was younger, I definitely played more of the N64 than the PlayStation. I don't even know where the hell our PlayStation 1 came from. Maybe we'll have to ask Anji for confirmation. Yeah, I mean, it just disappeared. I'm assuming it was a present from my cousin, because she was also a big gamer back then. But the N64, my mom had like a few old consoles, like the NES, the SNES, and then I guess eventually we ended up with an N64. I definitely remember more of the games on there and playing those a lot more. I didn't have any of the original Zeldas for it, but I had like Donkey Kong 64. I remember begging one Christmas for it because it just looked different from everything else. And I remember seeing it in like Toys R Us with like, I was like, oh, it comes with like the red little memory expansion thing with it, because it was required for like the newer games. But I was like, had Paper Mario, not I think Pilot Wings. I'm not sure if it was on that one.
Pilot Wings was a launch title for the 64.
Okay. I was like, I might maybe had it for that one. I don't know if it was for the N64 or I doubt for PlayStation. It was for the, and I think it was for the SNES. I'm trying really hard to remember what games I had on there, but I remember playing the N64 more often. I just look back in nostalgia for more Nintendo games than I do for PlayStation. 0 for Xbox, because I didn't even have the original Xbox.
Well, the Xbox was until next generation, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. Because this generation, it was the race between PlayStation, N64, and then Saturn's also there, which got crushed by the PlayStation like almost instantly as soon as it released.
I only remember like 3 games for the PlayStation, and the one I played the most was Crash Bash, the CTR, and the Spider-Man 1 game. So
yeah,
it was really random games.
I agree, because it's almost, I have a similar story. So I was really young when these games these consoles came out. I played the Super Nintendo and 64 far after the fact. My first console was a Game Boy Color, if you want to be technical about it. But I played them a lot at my friend's house, my friend who had all the consoles and stuff, right? I loved the N64. I say I loved it, even though I played 2 games for it. All we did was play Smash Brothers and Pokemon Stadium all the fucking time. But that was good enough for me, right? Like, honestly, I never even touched Mario, Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64. I touched Banjo-Kazooie. That was fun. I also I like that a lot. And Star 64. I played that quite a bit at my friend's house, but I never actually owned a 64 myself until I was in college, and now I have the one I have now. So my experience with the 64 was always secondhand, but it was even less so with the PlayStation. Even among all my friends, we would always play Nintendo stuff. We hardly ever touched the PlayStation. When we did, it was only, I think I played CTR and Spyro, I think, was like the only two PlayStation games I remember playing. And then that Looney Tunes game I bought when I was visiting you, Corey, the last time. I remember playing that too. That was interesting.
Is that straight up Looney Tunes, or was that like the Wile E. Coyote?
I mean, it's Looney Tunes. It has Looney Tunes like on the cover, but it is dealing with Wile E. Coyote. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so I really did not play that many games on the PlayStation. Again, kind of why I was shocked at all these numbers, right? But back to the history lesson. So here's the big thing: why I feel, and why the general gaming historians feel that why the N64 like vastly underperformed in terms of sales. So, as I previously said, they stuck with the ROM cartridges, right? So the cartridges compared to CD-ROMs were like vastly inferior, mainly due to storage space. So a CD or a ROM cartridge could only hold about 64 megabytes of data, which back then wasn't insignificant. But compared to a CD-ROM that could hold 650 megabytes worth of data, it was like crazy how much more a CD-ROM could hold, right? So that usually led to any kind of third-party games being ported to the cartridge having to have mainly audio stripped out of it. Very, very little N64 games had any kind of FMV, full motion video, because those files were huge. So a lot of the times 64 games, if they were third party that released both on PlayStation and the Saturn and came to the 64, were actually missing features and content that were in the other games. So I mean, if you had the choice, you're going to buy the one that had, the full content on it. Why wouldn't you?
That's still something that happens today, that people choose to have like really high end games like God of War and stuff on the main consoles rather than on Switch or anything Nintendo related.
Well, yeah, and I'm going to do a brief comparison, where PlayStation and Nintendo stand as of today at the end, but that'll just be a brief thing. But so yeah, the storage space was bad. So a lot of audio files, no video files, and other content had to be, and compression strategies did get better because they managed to fit, I think it was Resident Evil 2 they managed to cram that onto a cartridge eventually, but it made it a lot more annoying for third-party developers to work with the cartridge because they had such a limited amount of space to work with. Not only that, apparently Nintendo's licensing fees were pretty expensive because they had to license these cartridges directly from Nintendo. The cartridges also took weeks to manufacture as opposed to CD-ROMs only taking days. Also, again, apparently the licensing for the CD-ROMs are much cheaper than the cartridges as well. The cartridges weren't without some advantages. One being, since they didn't have to read from a disc, there was very little loading times on cartridge-based gaming. So, that was a plus. Also, this is Nintendo's general strategy, but having an esoteric form of game, cartridge, it made piracy a lot harder. Not impossible, just harder. But yeah, so a lot of people cite these cartridges being like the main reason why, because obviously third-party developers vastly favored the PlayStation when it came to making their games because it was just easier and less expensive to make. Not only to mention making cartridges not only took longer, it was just more expensive in general just to produce cartridges over CD-ROMs. Now that being said, do you guys even if it's just the aesthetics of a cartridge, do you like the cartridge of the N64? Even the cartridges in general, do you like them on the SNES, the NES, or do you prefer having your games on CDs and stuff like that?
The load time is something that I really appreciate on the cartridges. That and I've been hauling my collection around for years. And the cartridges don't break like a jewel case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I spent more of my time, spending most of my time trying to figure out how to fucking clean scratches out of CDs would drive you insane. But the cartridge, just being able to throw it and put it in a bag and take it wherever you wanted, never have to worry about it. That was always a good thing.
There is a weird amount of just strange CD cleaning devices that kind of circulated around when the PlayStation was like introduced to the public, because there'd be scratch discs, and I think Blockbuster, like Blockbuster had their own disc cleaning thing, and you could find all these different stupid tools or this magic liquid you spray on the bottom and rub it with a cloth, and you have to use this special cloth, and like CD cleaners was such a just a weird object that I don't think you really see around anymore. I mean, you can find them, but like they're not as prevalent on the store shelves as they used to be, where it was like, that's the brand you want, because I accidentally scratched my whatever music CD when I was listening to it, and like now it skips all the time, and this made it better. I like the weird technology that comes from stuff like this, so that was kind of interesting. But like I would have problems with discs. I'd have to wipe them, or like the jewel case, if you're not paying attention and it's sitting on the floor. I lent somebody a game and he gave me back my case in a different case because he's like, I accidentally destroyed your jewel case. I'm sorry. It's like, God, man, I think it was Grandia or something I lent him. I was like, man, I'm glad the discs are okay, because I love that game, and I'm so sad that you just exploded this stupid damn jewel case all over your living room because you're an idiot. But like you can throw the 64 cartridge like down the street and it'll still play. It's crazy.
It's Nintendo's famous durability.
I hope you like it.
Yeah. The cartridges do have pretty good durability. I mean, obviously they're still in circulation right now. Along with the CD-ROMs, obviously, but there's just more of them, so they're easier to find, or replaceable, I suppose. But yeah, like I said, third-party support was massively in favor of the PlayStation. They'd occasionally try and port their games to the Switch, but it was always 64, and it was always a pain in the ass for them. So they'd always be like, "Well, let's go with PlayStation. It's easier, cheaper, a better profit this way." So companies like Konami, Square, and Enix, since they were not together at this point, all favored PlayStation, and obviously PlayStation vastly benefited from this. Here's a fun fact. Nintendo obviously had a lot, they have first-party games. They make games in-house. They've been doing it since the N64 days. Sony, being new to the gaming scene, did not have, in-house development team. They were completely reliant on third-party games, which is why, focusing on the CD-ROM aspect was so beneficial for them, because it made it way more appealing for third-party companies to get, work with them as opposed to Nintendo, because that was the lifeblood of PlayStation, right? And here's another crazy numbers game for you. This is again mainly due to the third parties favoring the PlayStation. So over the course of its lifespan, the N64 had a total of 388 games published for it, right? Now, the PlayStation, over its lifespan, had a total of 4,105 games published for that console.
There's no way a lot of those are good.
Oh, no. Like, I didn't say they were good, but, this is a quantity over quality thing, obviously. But that being said, Juggernauts were also released on PlayStation. Obviously, we have Crash Bandicoot, we have Spyro, we have Final Fantasy VII, which you are literally playing right now. That is the birthplace of that game. Gran Turismo, stuff like that. And obviously PlayStation was a much more loose with their content, basically, because it was also, I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but we had the whole video games cause violence and stuff like that, and this whole era is the place for the ESRB and stuff like that. But that being said, PlayStation was marketing towards a more mature audience, and they wanted to, so when stuff like Mortal Kombat and shit that came out, blood, gore, fuck it, do it. But again, a lot of things that came to the N64 had to be censored, on top of content being stripped out, which made it even less appealing for the developers.
Yeah. So yeah, PlayStation and Xbox had some weird fucking commercials.
Yeah. That would be fun actually to watch some old commercials, but yeah. So the N64, obviously I'm not saying it didn't have any games. N64 had great games, but it was really like again a lot of trends for Nintendo. A lot of them were first party games since it was just their own software, hardware they were developing for. And then really the only notable, I guess it's more of like a second party developer because they worked so closely with them. But Rare obviously was a huge influence on the N64, and they came out with half of the good games that came out for them was come from Rare and Nintendo. I guess so. When you think about the PlayStation and the N64, right? If you had a gun to your head and had to say which one you had more games that you liked, which one do you think had the better games? Would it be the PlayStation or the N64?
Ooh, that's
I feel
tough.
like this is a fight between quantity over quality.
Hey, this is a personal question. I'm not saying you to look at it objectively. Like, which one do you think had better games?
I'm gonna lean on PlayStation for that one because 64
Really?
does have Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time, and I do love those games a lot. But like when I go back to turn my 64 on, I guess Pilot Wings, because I always play Pilot Wings. Like I at some point I'm going to play Pilot Wings 64 in the year. It's just inevitable for me, which is why I recently had it as a recommended short because I just love that game. But there's not as many games that I want to go back to play on 64 as there are the PlayStation 1 because like the JRPGs that I love playing like Thousand Arms, Wild Arms, Final Fantasy 7 and 9, not necessarily 8, Vandal Hearts, Xenogears. Like there's just so many big RPG games that are like rare games, I guess, are more costly in my collection, and they're all on PlayStation 1. I do have Mega Man Legends on both 64 and PlayStation 1, which I would play the 64 one primarily because the loading screen is not there, and but I would play Resident Evil 2 on PlayStation rather than 64, even though I have both, but I don't know. It's just strange. I feel like it's muddier on the 64 than it is on the PlayStation because they use their cool like texture technique to kind of soften the graphics, I guess, a bit, rather than how PlayStation was more hard pixel edge.
It's funny because technically speaking, the 64 could render textures better than the PlayStation could, but because of the low memory on the cartridge, they had to like basically use less textures and stretch them more, which actually made them look worse than they could have. So in that aspect, the 64 was better, but we are limited by the cartridge.
Yeah.
Jordan, what do you think? You have a gun to your head. Pick one, PlayStation or N64, which had better games?
Man, I'm probably gonna have to say I would go over. For me, it's gonna be. Man, I'm gonna say. I know. Fuck. Okay, I'm gonna say N64 just because I had a better. I guess I had more fun with that in a sense that the N64 was always like open to playing with 4 players at once rather than just 2 players, and I would always be going and having those kind of events where you just be basically playing out with a whole bunch of people in this one group, playing pretty fun games. Like I said, Super Smash Brothers, N64, Mario Party,
Extreme G.
GoldenEye. Extreme G was hard, but that was cool.
Yeah.
And then Pilot Wing. Was Pilot Wings 4-player? No, that was only 2-player, right? Or 1-player?
Pilot Wings was 1 player, but like we passed the controllers around to do various missions. There's not that many missions in the game, but like you just delete your save and then start it over again because it's one of those weird games that has such a high replayability even in the easiest levels because the physics in it is just so good that the game today feels like really nice, even compared to some modern games.
And that's a good point what you just said. Yeah, replayability. Like that was the huge thing for me was that you'd play a game, you'd beat it, and then you'd play it again. Rather than PlayStation, I would play the game, beat it, and then I'd move on. I would never come back to the same game over and over unless there was only one exception. That was playing Sledstorm, which was like a snow machining game, and I only played that just because it was like the music was so good, and also
you played Tekken a lot.
Well, Tekken fighting game. I mean, that's for sure. But at the same time, I was doing that mainly because it was just like it was one of those competitive things that I had going for myself, and I was really having fun getting to know the characters a lot more. Versus like I played Street Fighter and all that, never really had a connection. It was for some weird reason, Tekken was fun. interesting that playing with some weird characters, so it made things a lot more interesting than they were. But the N64 again, I have been nonstop playing that thing when it came out. It was really hard for me to put it down, and even if I didn't have people come over, I'd still be wanting to get better at playing characters on Super Smash Brothers and stuff. So yeah, I would say N64. Even though PlayStation had a huge library, I still think 64 had a really good control over quality in a game to make you want to continuously keep playing it. It was really, really good.
I think my opinion weighing towards PlayStation, because I have a lot of fond memories of playing 64, but like being an only child, like I played a lot of single player games in my downtime, and so I would play all these JRPGs and stuff. So my PlayStation library is much bigger than the 64 library, but the 64 does have a lot of party games that are really fun. So whenever friends would come over and spend the night, or Jordan was coming over, we walked through a couple of the titles that we mentioned that are really fun to play. But there is a lot of fun games to play on 64 with people. So there's 2-player games on the PlayStation, but usually they're like weird Contra-esque type games like Assault Retribution, and I don't know. Contra, I think, and there's a handful of other ones. I think I had Road Rash 3D and some other ones, but
Road
fighting
Rash
games,
cool.
I guess. Huh?
Road Rash was cool.
Road
That
Rash.
was a dope ass game. Beat people over with fucking bikers, and you beat each other's asses on with a chain and stuff while you ride motorcycles.
The more I think about it, I do remember one PlayStation 1 I did play a lot with my cousin was Twisted Metal. We played that a lot. I liked Twisted Metal. That was fun.
I just watched the first episode of the second season today. It's such a weird show to just exist, I guess, based on a franchise. But it's like I like watching it because it's just like I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to put this.
I'm going to put this one in the box labeled games that should have not had any kind of narrative adaptation at all. I mean, honestly, I just pay for like a fucking just a quick like hour and a half long horror movie of Sweet Tooth just fucking killing people. Like that would I'd just be like, yeah, it's good enough. That's probably about as much story I feel as I'm going to care about fucking Twisted Metal.
But over the Bambi horror movie that's coming out.
Like, don't even.
He's gonna break his brain.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I mean, I'm biased because obviously, as I already, ousted myself, I had very little PlayStation 1 experience, but I still feel like, and this is the primary, like, my primary, hypothesis of why the 64 is looked back upon with such reverence, even though, it got outsold in nearly every aspect, was that, you had groundbreaking games in the 64. Now, not only was this the birthplace of 3D graphics between the 64 and the PlayStation, but Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye 007, games whose franchises besides 007 continue on today. I mean, 007 was still revolutionary in the fact that it was like, wow, this is a licensed game, but it was an amazing first-person shooter. But like Mario and Zelda obviously are still going on. Where's Crash Bandicoot? Where is Spyro? Where is all these franchises that were born on the PlayStation and continued in the PS2 era, but now we've just given up on them, not us as a community, but Sony has. So it's just kind of sad in that regard. Final Fantasy's still around, obviously. I mean, Final Fantasy VII is being split up into 3 fucking games, meaning you pay over $100 for the same fucking game you get on PlayStation. But I would choose N64 for no other reason than, like, not only, Ocarina of Time by itself is regarded as, like, one of the best video games of all time, whether I agree with that or not, regardless. I mean, when we first played it for the podcast, I was like, wow, I can see why people love this game a whole lot. Obviously Mario 64 was the, this is the standard for 3D platforming. And that was a launch title for the console. But anyways,
Wait, my turn.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd pick the N64 as well. There's like the switch up later on. It's like, well, I prefer the N64 over the PlayStation 1. It's mainly because I had some games for the PlayStation 1. I didn't really play them as much as I did the N64. But it switches around because I have more experience with PlayStation on the PlayStation 2 than I do on the GameCube. So it's kind of like a vice versa of the generations.
Yeah, like you and me are kind of in the same boat in that regard. Now a couple smaller things that kind of define the difference between the two consoles. The N64 did try to make a disk drive add-on late in its life cycle. It was created and it was released in Japan. It failed miserably to the point where they just canceled the release for it worldwide. It was mainly due to the fact it was late in its lifespan, and I guess I have confusing data like research on why really it failed. It was I guess it was confusing to develop for. No one really wanted to do it after the fact, and there was 3 or 4 games that ever released on it, so they just dropped it.
Now it's a super rare collectible item.
Yeah, it's a collectible item, and it's something to have. I'm glad if anyone has it. Oh, sorry how much you paid for it.
Right next to my sewing machine.
Yeah, my sewing machine. So another small advantage the PlayStation had at the time was, again, could play, use CD-ROMs. Going back to the CD-ROM thing, PlayStation could play music discs just as good as any other music player. And nowadays we take music for granted, but back in that day, a music player that was also your game console was great. You don't have to get a stereo anymore. You can just use your PlayStation. And according to a lot of audio aficionados, apparently, the PlayStation at the time was really high quality audio, competing with top tier audio equipment that you could buy elsewhere for much more, thousands of dollars. Apparently, maybe that's an exaggeration of what I've seen.
I wouldn't be surprised considering Sony is a market for audio systems and sound bars and TV.
Yeah, they weren't game developers, but they knew their audio. Like I said, they were actually responsible for the audio chip in the Super Nintendo prior to this generation. So, so the audio and playing CDs was a big bonus for the PlayStation. Seems benign nowadays, but back then was a huge plus. Another small thing, the controllers. People, generally cite the N64 controller as probably being one of the worst controllers ever designed. Maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but I kind of agree with them. I like it, but I like weird shit. When your controller has 4 or 5 different ways you can hold to it to what game you're playing, it's kind of confusing. The PlayStation's was a lot more generalized, and really the only update they had to do for it was adding the dual joysticks later in its lifespan to help people maneuver around all the 3D environments they were creating for the games. So people were turned off by that too. So they were turned off by some people were turned off by the controller, obviously. In a sense, the PlayStation was more successful just as a broader appeal, and just it was a quantity over quality. But at the same time, it was they still have good games on the PlayStation. Doesn't mean they didn't. But when people think about the N64, they think about the 10, 15 games that, all of them are basically either first-party developed Nintendo games or Rare games. And I mean, Rareware, whatever you want to call them. But those games were just so damn good that's why people remember that console, And it's kind of funny because the big thing, I keep restating it, but the big thing that made the difference was the CD versus the cartridge thing. And Nintendo's only done CDs for, I guess, DVDs, technically, for the Wii and the Wii U. Then with the Switch, they went right back to cartridges, modern day cartridges, but cartridges nonetheless. So it's just funny that the Wii was super, not, obviously a lot more factors play into that than the game's medium, but it's just funny how reluctant they were to switch over to the CD thing, and they tried to, course correct with the add-on, but it was just too expensive and too late in the life cycle. That being said, it's it's fun in a hypothetical world. Do you think that had they stuck with the CD, if the N64 were the CD-ROM based system, do you think it would have dominated the PlayStation? Like, do you agree with the hypothesis that the CD-ROM format was the primary reason why the PlayStation succeeded, or do you really think that Corey had his own personal reasons, but it's like, was it really just the games for the system and not necessarily like, do you think the games are good, but clearly wasn't good enough to sell more N64? People still gravitated more towards the PlayStation. What do you guys think?
I think that the PlayStation's approach to have low licensing fees and mass appeal, not to people, but to publishers to kind of partner with them, is the main success. If Nintendo was charging too much, it was just cheaper for companies to get to develop the same thing. And I would argue that having the open, potentially limitless possibility of a CD-ROM versus having to deal with the cartridge, because Nintendo's notoriously had third-party headaches from people trying to develop for their consoles and stuff. But the PlayStation's, if Nintendo did discs, I think it would have still kind of ended up the same way, because Nintendo's relationship with other people putting stuff on their platform and how they kind of, bring the hammer down to make them follow their rules. It might have lowered the cost and stuff, but I would almost argue too that the cartridges' limited space is why the games that were produced for the 64 were so good or memorable, because they had a box they had to build in and make the most of, rather than this 4,000 games on the PlayStation, but I guarantee 3,000 of them are probably absolute dog shit, because they're like, we can do anything, and then that ends up being nothing. And I have some of those games. They've made it to my library, like Rat Attack, Evil Zone is this terrible fighting game, Bubsy 3D.
You could almost say it's like when you look on the fucking Switch Online store.
Yeah, when you're looking through the Switch Online store and it's like 10,000 hentai something game, and it's an image match game or whatever, and it's like, what is this? How is all of this getting on here so fast?
Mm-hmm. That kind of leads me into my last thing that I wanted to talk about, was the from the first Sony versus Nintendo clash with the PlayStation versus the N64, which the PlayStation numbers wise won. However, I think, like I said, in retrospect, people look more fondly on the N64, mainly due to just the quality of the games between Nintendo and Rare is just so high. Not that they don't look on fondly on the PlayStation. I just always feel that people talk about the N64 way more often when they talk about this generation than the PlayStation. Now, obviously PlayStation 2 also crushed records. The GameCube didn't do so well. They're hot either. But then the Wii comes out. They do that generation. But basically, fast forwarding to now, right? The Switch has immense third-party support. As Corey just said, you just have to ask whoever the fuck works, the janitor at Nintendo headquarters, and be like, hey, can I put this on the Switch Online store? Like, yeah, sure, whatever. They don't even look at it. They'll just let you use it. Now, not saying the PlayStation store is any better, quite frankly. It's like open season for people who want to publish games on both those digital platforms. But the third-party support for Nintendo has grown immensely. Like a smaller note is that, weirdly enough, Sony and Nintendo have done a flip-flop in terms of censorship, at least how I feel, because I said before, Nintendo was really hardcore into their family-friendly image during the 64 days, and they still are to an extent today, obviously, but they had a lot of things censored for the 64 carts, a lot of removal of blood and body parts and shit like that. Like Duke Nukem was horribly censored on the 64 version. Any images to alcohol, drugs, sex appeal, all that shit had to be taken out. Nowadays, I feel Sony actually censors more of their stuff nowadays, where Nintendo is just like, yeah, as long as rated appropriately, you can release it on the console. We don't care. Because there is some raunchy shit on the fucking Switch store that I don't think would ever have passed muster back in the day. I'm not even talking about like the crappy hentai games, stuff like what is it? Some of those JRPGs you can get from like Play Asia and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a lot more edgy content kind of stuff that you find on the Switch.
And stuff that Sony hated, like one of my favorite ecchi series, Senran Kagura, they just kind of gave up. They were mainly releasing on Sony consoles, but they kept hammering the censorship down to the point where it's like, well, we don't even want to make these fucking games anymore because they don't even make it fun. They won't let us do anything. And so it's like, well,
the last censorship that I like actually heard about was like one of the games that I bought, and people were angry about it because it was on a day one patch. It was for the first Fairy Tale game, and then all the panty shots that where the camera was like under low angle, they just made it where every underskirt is just a void rather than a panty shot, and a lot of people were angry about that. I didn't even start playing the game, so I didn't even fucking know that.
Can't you see panties?
And I mean, it's not Nintendo doesn't do it because I mean, you know, Smash Brothers when they brought in Pyro and Mythra, they had to do a little bit of censoring, but it was like tasteful censoring. At half the time, people were like, "Hey, I kind of like this better." Even like Nintendo is much more lax on their censorship nowadays. To the point, like I said, to the point where it's almost kind of laughable. Nintendo's IPs are still going really strong, whereas you know, Rare unfortunately got bought by Microsoft and they got thrown in the gutter. But Sony is kind of weirdly, you know, I hesitate to say struggling, but like their identity still isn't as strong as Nintendo's. Whereas Nintendo's, you know, marketing strategy, you know, we discussed it a couple podcast episodes ago, is just like their first party games are the reason why you buy their consoles. They've usually always been behind in terms of power. That's still the case today. PS5 is way more powerful than even a Switch 2. And Switch 2 is still lagging behind, but those first-party games are where people keep coming back for. Those exclusive games on the Nintendo hardware is what people keep coming back for. So, you know, remember what I said at the beginning here. 34 million units sold for the N64, 103 million of the PlayStation, right? So here's some numbers for the Switch versus the PS5. I'm not including any iterations of the PS5 Pro, PS5 Slim, or the Switch 2. We're just talking about the Switch and the PS5. Now, we don't have hard numbers yet, obviously. They're still being sold and they haven't been discontinued yet. So the rough numbers I have, the Switch has shipped 153 million units at 2025. You know, not bought, shipped. You know, mark my words on that. The PS5, again, regular PS5, not counting its other iterations, has shipped 75 million as of 2023. Now that is a 2-year difference, but it's almost 100 million difference in terms of units. So if we're gonna be, you know, generous in how many of those actually sell, the Switch is kind of like squashing the PS5 in terms of units sold. You know, it's almost not nearly as bad as the 64 versus the PlayStation, but it is definitely flip flopped in terms of like popularity. Now why do you think that is? Why do you think the PlayStation, you know, even if we're going to talk, you know, if it was the cartridge versus the CD-ROM back in the day, what do you think happened that kind of shifted the popularity back into Nintendo's favor, despite their consoles still being vastly inferior in terms of power?
Hands down, portability. Though you just said
really,
yeah. I think because the DS, like the handheld market for Nintendo, has always just been theirs. PlayStation tried to get in there with the PSP and the Vita, but I mean, I had a PSP. I didn't have a Vita. I know that you can get a digital-only Vita. I can't remember if they were... I don't know. Did they have mini discs or something?
I don't even know what that means.
But you can't use it because the store is shut down anyway. So it's just like, hey, here's a piece of plastic. But Nintendo, their handhelds have been just dominating. You know, I think Game Boy, the original Game Boy, was one of like the best-selling gaming devices of all time. But now that the Switch kind of became their next handheld and console. So the people that carried a DS with them everywhere they went, and we know a lot of those people. You know, we went to college with a lot of these people.
Dude, I still get Street Passes when I go on like flights now.
Yeah, I mean, people were playing Smash Brothers, and when Pokemon Sun and Moon came out, it was crazy, right? And so now that the Switch exists and it's portable, people were like, "Oh hell yeah!" Because it's kind of like, you know, I have a console experience in my hands. And, you know, someone would argue that it's not the greatest console experience because, you know, oh, the memory chip isn't as good as the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, bro, I don't care about that shit. I don't need it to be more powerful than the PlayStation. I just need it to be fun. And it is fun. So it's doing its job.
And, I mean, if I would like to just do a comparison of the two different generations. So, like, PlayStation and N64... Like, I kind of think why PlayStation was doing a lot better was because of the technology that was going on back then was all CD-based. You know, DVD had just came out not too long ago, and they're basically running on the same spots as what they are. So DVDs were always around. Everywhere was basically, if you had some money, of course, you were using it versus the VHS. So DVDs and CDs with the PlayStation, it was just like kind of a hand-in-hand situation where it was a lot more common. Cartridges for the N64, not so common. Different type of technology where they were having to figure out ways to make that work when everybody was already comfortable with CDs. And that's kind of what made it a little bit more easier for them to push out that product for that to work, because everybody's listening to music, everybody's trying to do things that were basically as close as they could get to fun in that world. Versus now, we now moved on to portability with cell phones as being like your main computer, software and everything that's being done digitally. You know, internet is the big key. Everything is being done always by just download. And the fact that PlayStation and even Xbox and them, you know, at this point, we're always just doing regular. You'd have to be at your basically in front of your TV for things to work out. Switch was already able to be portable, so everybody can move around. It's like a different change in the generations of what's happened. So like people are now seeming to come over with, I want to be able to go where I want to with the game in my hands, rather than I'm stuck at a TV and I can't go anywhere. I have to sit still. So it seems like there was a huge changing point from back then, because cell phones and everything they weren't even a big thing back then. So there was a different change in pace and how people were going about with video games. And now that it's gone a different route, people are now looking at the edge of, if you're more portable, I'm going to pick you over the other system.
It's kind of funny because I find it funny how you guys both pick portability. It's not the main reason I would choose it, because as you just said, you know, cell phones are a thing nowadays. I think the Switch finds it hard to. I think the Switch finds it hard to compete with a cell phone, simply because, you know, for me personally, when I think of portability, it needs to be able to fit in my pocket. I don't really use a Switch for portability unless I'm on a plane or something. I mean, don't get me wrong. For the normies, I'm sure that's plenty true enough. But I think it's literally the same strength they had in the N64. Just now, people don't care as much about technology, as you were just saying, Jordan. You know, new technology, people want all the shit. I mean, that was another reason the PlayStation 2 did as well as it did, because that could also play DVDs. It was a DVD player, it was a CD player, it was a game player, it was like an all-in-one thing. You have that one thing in your living room, and that was still during the days where people just bought DVD players. That's all they did, you know. But nowadays, streaming services and all this other crap all these consoles can do, like the Switch still has, you know, Nintendo still has their first party games, and the only way you're going to play them is on the Switch. And I still feel like that's the biggest drive, because people still just, you know, most people, when they think of video games, they'll think of Mario, they'll think of Pokemon, they'll think of Zelda. They don't really think of God of War too much. Not saying God of War isn't popular. It's definitely popular among, you know, gamers and stuff like that, but among the normal population, not so much. So I feel like it's like now that we not care as much about the technology, because obviously PlayStation 5 is still leaps and bounds ahead of you know, of that technology. But in order to keep, you know, Nintendo could if they wanted to, obviously, but they want to keep, you know, production costs down and keep the Switch portable. So they choose to, you know, axe the power in a lot of cases, which is why I was so impressed with the Switch too. But, you know, it's still going to be the best with their first party games. The games, I feel, are what sell it, are really what drives the point home, because, you know, most people all know Nintendo properties, and they're still, you know, for the most part, a large, broad spectrum, are as good as they were before. You know, Bonanza's great. That's what I would say. I think Switch has been more successful, because now their strength is even stronger in the modern day climate, because the previous strengths of the consoles of the past aren't viewed as much as a strength anymore. But what do you think, Edwin? Do you agree with those two guys, or do you have your own opinion?
Well, now that I think about it, portability is just like one factor that just makes it so much more valuable to have. Because back then, PlayStation 1 and N64, they were fighting for pretty much the same market. It's just the home console. But at the time, Nintendo still had the Game Boy, so they still made money off the portability market, which they pretty much had a tight grip on. And then years down the line, the PSP came out, but Nintendo had the DS, which could play old Game Boy games and new DS games. Obviously, you're gonna buy that shit up because like, oh, I can play my old games and new games. So like, yeah, I'll buy that over the PSP. And then now, with the Switch the Switch 2 is still cheaper than the PS5, and it's also portable. So it's your home console and your portable console. So it's literally a 2-for-1. You can progress to any game on the Switch twice as fast because you can take it with you. The only way you can do that with the PlayStation is the PlayStation Portal, which I tested Corey's out on my PlayStation, and it works, but it breaks connection very easily if your internet is not absolutely secure. So it's useful, but I wouldn't say it's reliable. So Nintendo has, it's far superior than a PlayStation in terms of availability to play and the cost, as well as you get to play first-party games and third-party games that everyone loves.
And I think that's a great perspective. Obviously we're able to play a lot of the more popular games now with the N64. I mean, the N64 expansion or the virtual console they have on the Switch now, you had to pay the expansion pass for. They thought that was a selling point of the expansion pass subscription because it's like, oh, N64, because it had great games. But that wasn't good enough back then. But yeah, that pretty much reached the end of my rope. I just wanted to share this, little bite of history I saw, and wanted to have everyone's opinions on it. I hope everyone, hopefully learned something from that little spiel. I left out a lot of details, especially concerning the corporate back and forth between Nintendo and Sony when they were trying to work together, and that was an event. But I find this stuff very interesting, and I hope the listeners found it, at least somewhat interesting. I love this shit. I love finding the scenes with history, consoles and games and stuff like that. But unless you guys have any last thoughts on the 64 or the PlayStation, or anything about the discussion in general, I'm good.
All right, sweet. Well, all right, I guess, we'll be wrapping it up today. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify, Twitter, YouTube, and our Rumble channel so you never miss an episode. And to all you gamers out there, just remember to keep exploring, keep playing, keep listening. Until next time, this is the Mediocre Rumble Brothers.
Hey, this is Corey. Thanks for checking out Mediocre Rumble Brothers. If you liked the video, please drop a like, and if you didn't, that's fine too. If you'd like us to talk about any specific games, drop a comment below, or feel free to discuss your experience with the games that we've mentioned in the episode. You can also listen to our episodes prior to YouTube on our Spotify. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you again soon.